Imagine being told that the word hell does not appear even once in the original text of the Bible. Not as a modern concept, not as an eternal place of fire where the damned scream for eternity. That is not in the original Hebrew. It is not in the Aramaic. It was not in the minds of the first biblical writers when they put their words onto parchment. What did exist was something completely different, something darker in certain ways, more ambiguous, more unsettling than any flame. It was called Sheol, and Sheol was not hell. Sheol was simply the place where the dead go. All the dead, the good and the wicked, the righteous and the sinner. Abraham went to Sheol. Job begged to go to Sheol to escape his suffering. The Psalms speak of Sheol as if it were the inevitable darkness waiting for every human being, without distinction, without judgment, without fire. So, how did we get from that to the hell we know today? Who took that vague and silent concept, that cave of shadows where the dead slept, and turned it into a place of eternal torture administered by demons? The answer involves Greek translators with their own agenda, a real city called Gehenna where corpses were burned, Roman theologians who needed a tool of social control, and a process spanning centuries that transformed a Jewish metaphor into the most powerful theological weapon in Western history. And the most disturbing part, there are serious scholars, not fringe conspiracy theorists, not YouTube commentators, but tenured professors at Oxford, Harvard, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem who argue that this transformation was not accidental, that it was deliberate, that someone at some point in history made a choice. Welcome to this channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. Let us start at the very beginning. Not the beginning of Christianity, not even the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Let us start at the beginning of what human beings believed happened after death, because to understand how hell was invented, you first need to understand the world that existed before anyone had thought of it. The ancient Near East was a world saturated with the dead. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and Babylonians believed in a place called the Kur, or sometimes the Irkalla, named after its queen. It was a dark underworld, a land of no return, where the dead ate dust and clay and lived in permanent dimness. There was no fire. There was no punishment for the wicked. There was no reward for the good. There was simply existence, gray and diminished for everyone. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written thousands of years before the Bible, describes a ghost rising from the underworld, looking emaciated and terrified, not because he had been punished, but simply because the underworld was terrible for everyone equally. The scholar Thorkild Jacobson, one of the greatest Assyriologists of the 20th century, described the Mesopotamian underworld as a place defined not by moral judgment, but by absence. Absence of light, absence of food, absence of joy. Now, here is what should stop you in your tracks. The early Israelites believed almost exactly the same thing. This is the part that almost nobody in a Sunday sermon will tell you. The Hebrew Bible describes Sheol dozens of times. And when you read those descriptions carefully, without the interpretive overlay of 2,000 years of Christian theology, what you find is startling. Sheol in the Hebrew Bible is not a place of punishment. It is not a place of fire. It is not even a place where God is present, which is remarkable in itself because the Psalms repeatedly describe Yahweh as omnipresent everywhere except explicitly in Sheol. Psalm 115 says plainly, "The dead do not praise the Lord, neither do any who go down into silence." The dead are silent. They do not praise, they do not suffer, they do not experience anything. They are simply gone into the dark. Psalm 88 is even more harrowing. It is one of the most despairing texts in the entire Hebrew Bible, a psalm with no resolution, no comfort, no happy ending. The writer says the dead are cut off from God's hand, set apart among the slain who lie in the grave, whom God remembers no more. Do you hear what this is saying? The writer does not believe God remembers the dead. Sheol is not a realm God governs. It is a realm outside of God's reach. This is not Christian theology. This is not Islamic theology. This is a profoundly ancient belief that death is simply ending, not reward, not punishment, not transformation, just ending. Ecclesiastes pushes this even further. The preacher writes that the fate of men and beasts is the same. As one dies, so dies the other. All go to one place. All are from the dust, and to dust all return. Dust. Not heaven, not hell, dust. So, where did the idea of eternal punishment come from? To answer that, you need to follow the trail of a single word. A word that was mistranslated, expanded, weaponized, and eventually turned into the most terrifying concept in human religious history. That word is Gehenna, and Gehenna is not a metaphor. It is a place. It exists on a map. You can visit it today. Southwest of the old city of Jerusalem, there is a valley. In Hebrew, it is called Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. In the time of the ancient Israelite kings, this valley had a dark reputation. According to the second book of Kings and the book of Jeremiah, it was a place where some Israelites, under the influence of Canaanite religious practices, performed the sacrifice of children by fire to a deity called Molech. King Josiah defiled the valley to make it ritually unclean and stop these practices. He turned it into a garbage dump, a place of burning refuse, a place where the bodies of criminals and those deemed unworthy of proper burial were thrown and incinerated. By the time of Jesus, Gehenna was a word every Jew in Jerusalem understood. It meant the valley south of the city. It meant smoke and fire and the smell of burning. It was not supernatural. It was not eternal. It was geography. When Jesus uses the word Gehenna in the Gospels, he is using a word his listeners understood as a literal physical location. When he says in Matthew that it is better to lose one eye than to have your whole body thrown into Gehenna, he may not be describing the afterlife at all. He may be using a culturally specific metaphor his audience would immediately recognize. The burning garbage dump, the place of shame and disposal, the place outside the city where the disgraced ended up. This is the interpretation of multiple serious New Testament scholars, including Joachim Jeremias, whose landmark work on the historical Jesus remains essential reading, and more recently Sharon Baker, whose book Raising Hell argues that eternal conscious torment was simply not what first century Jewish listeners would have heard when Jesus spoke. They would have heard something closer to, "This sin will ruin you. This choice will put you in the garbage heap of history." But then the translations began. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the translators who produced what we now call the Septuagint, working in Alexandria around the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era, faced a problem. What do you do with Sheol? There is no Greek equivalent. Greek philosophy had its own underworld, Hades, which was, like Sheol, a morally neutral destination for all the dead. So the translators used Hades for Sheol, and for a while this worked reasonably well. But then the New Testament was written in Greek. Its authors sometimes used Hades, and sometimes used Gehenna, and sometimes used a third word, Tartarus, borrowed from Greek mythology, where the worst of the Titans were imprisoned. 3 different words, 3 different concepts, 3 different cultural backgrounds. And then came the Latin. In the 4th century, the scholar Jerome produced what would become the most influential translation of the Bible in history, the Vulgate. Jerome took Sheol, Hades, Gehenna, and Tartarus, 4 distinct concepts, and frequently translated all of them with a single Latin word, infernus, hell, 1 word to rule them all. 1 word to flatten the distinctions, erase the nuances, collapse the differences between a neutral resting place for all the dead, a Jerusalem garbage dump, a Greek mythological prison, and a Homeric underworld. This was not a trivial editorial decision. This was a transformation that would shape the imagination of Western civilization for 1,500 years. Here is something almost nobody in mainstream religious discourse discusses. The English word hell itself has nothing to do with fire. It comes from a Proto-Germanic root meaning to cover or to conceal. The Norse goddess Hel, who rules the land of the dead in Norse mythology, gives her name to the English word. Her realm is simply the covered place. the hidden place. Cold, gray, covered in shadow, but not burning. In early Germanic and Norse traditions, most of the dead went to Hell's realm by default. No fire, no torture. Just the end of the living world and the beginning of something quieter and darker. So, the English word hell, the Hebrew Sheol, the Norse hell, the Mesopotamian Kur, the Greek Hades, all of these from wildly different cultures and completely independent traditions converge on the same basic idea. Death is dark, death is quiet, death is not about punishment, death is about absence. The fire came later, and it came from very specific places for very specific reasons. To understand where the fire came from, you need to understand the apocalyptic movement in Judaism that exploded in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era. The Jewish people had suffered enormously. The Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE had shattered the established order. The temple had been destroyed. And then, after returning from exile, the Jews found themselves under Persian rule, then Greek rule, and finally under the most brutal oppression they had experienced. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who banned Jewish practice, desecrated the temple, and executed those who observed the Torah. This created a theological crisis. The old theology had been simple: obey God, be rewarded; disobey God, be punished, in this life, in this world. But this formula was catastrophically broken. Here were people dying precisely because they were obedient to God. Here were martyrs being killed for keeping the Sabbath. How do you explain that? The answer, developed in texts like the Book of Daniel and crucially the Book of Enoch, was radical. This life is not the final accounting. The dead will be raised. The righteous who died for their faith will be vindicated, and the wicked, including and especially those who persecuted the faithful, will be punished. This is the birth of resurrection theology in Judaism, and with resurrection comes its necessary dark counterpart, the judgment of the dead. And with the judgment of the dead comes the need for somewhere to put those who are judged guilty. The Book of Enoch is essential here. This is a text that never made it into the Hebrew Bible as we know it, but it was extraordinarily popular in the centuries around the turn of the Common Era. Fragments were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The New Testament letter of Jude quotes from it directly. Ethiopia's Orthodox Church still includes it in its biblical canon. They never let it go. And the Book of Enoch has fire. In one of its sections, called the Book of the Watchers, the angel Uriel shows Enoch a deep and terrible pit. Enoch asks what it is. Uriel explains, "This is the prison for those who rebelled." And in another valley, Enoch sees a place prepared for sinners, a place of fire that burns forever. This is genuinely new in the history of the Hebrew tradition. Here is a Jewish text written around the 2nd or 1st century BCE, describing a specific place of eternal fire for specific categories of sinners. Not all the dead, not Sheol for everyone, a special destination of punishment for those who deserve it. Why did this concept emerge at this particular historical moment? The historian Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, whose work on the origins of Satan and the devil is essential reading, argues that the answer is social and political. When a community is under existential threat, when its members are dying for their beliefs, the concept of postmortem punishment for the persecutors serves a vital psychological function. It keeps people faithful when faithfulness brings death. The oppressors may win in this world, they will not win in the next. This is not a cynical observation, it is a deeply human one, and it echoes across traditions. In Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion that almost certainly influenced Jewish thought during the exile, the dead cross the Shinvat bridge after death and are judged. The righteous cross safely to paradise. The wicked fall into a dark and terrible realm called Druj Damana, the house of the lie. This is one of the earliest fully developed afterlife judgment systems in world religion, and it predates the Jewish apocalyptic literature by centuries. The timeline and geography of the Persian exile make a meaningful encounter between these traditions almost certain In Hinduism, the realm of Naraka contains places of punishment described in extraordinary detail in the Garuda Purana. There are places for those who cheated, who broke their vows, who committed violence. But here is the crucial difference. In the Hindu conception, Naraka is not eternal. It is a place of temporary purification after which the soul is reincarnated and given another chance. Eternal torment is a specifically Western theological invention. In Buddhism, the Devadatta Sutta describes hellish realms presided over by Yama, the Lord of Death. Again, these realms are not permanent in Buddhist cosmology. They are stages in the cycle of rebirth. The concept of irrevocable damnation is strikingly absent. And in Islam, the picture is complex in ways rarely discussed in Western media. The Quran describes Jahannam in vivid and terrifying detail. Its fuel is people and stones. It has 7 gates. It has food like molten metal that boils in the belly. And yet, within Islamic theology, there is a significant and long standing debate about whether Jahannam is eternal for all its inhabitants. A number of classical scholars, including Ibn Taymiyyah in the medieval period, argued for the extinction of hell, the idea that even Jahannam will eventually be emptied and end. This is a minority position within Sunni orthodoxy, but it is not fringe. It is grounded in specific Quranic passages. The debate has never fully closed. So here is what we have: a morally neutral Sheol in early Hebrew thought, an apocalyptic explosion of afterlife judgment theology influenced by Persian Zoroastrianism, a real garbage dump in Jerusalem being used as a metaphor for ruin, a complex set of Greek words collapsed into a single Latin concept, and parallel traditions across South Asia and the Middle East that explore post-mortem consequence, but almost none of which land on eternal, irrevocable physical torment. So who built the hell we know? Tertullian, the 2nd century North African theologian, describes the punishments of hell with a relish that is startling to read today. In his work De Spectaculis, he imagines the pleasures awaiting the righteous in the afterlife, and those pleasures include watching the suffering of the damned. Kings who persecuted Christians, philosophers who mocked the faith, all writhing in the flames. Tertullian's hell is not a reluctant theological necessity. It is, in his telling, something close to entertainment for the saved. Origen, the brilliant and controversial 3rd century Alexandrian theologian, went in the opposite direction. He developed the doctrine of apokatastasis, the restoration of all things, the idea that eventually, through a process of purification spanning unimaginable ages, every soul, including Satan himself, would be restored to God. For Origen, the fire of hell was purifying, not punishing. God was not a torturer. God was a physician, and the fire was the surgery. The church condemned Origen's view. The Second Council of Constantinople in 553 declared apokatastasis a heresy. The eternal fire won. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, was perhaps the most consequential single voice in cementing the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. His City of God includes extended arguments for why hell must be eternal, why the fire is real and physical, and why God's justice requires that the punishment of the damned has no end. Augustine struggled with the apparent injustice of eternal punishment for finite sins. He knew it was a hard thing to defend, but he defended it, and because Augustine became the dominant theological voice of Western Christianity, his answers became the orthodox answers for 1,000 years. Here is the thing almost nobody discusses about Augustine's argument. It rests on a particular translation. Augustine read his Bible in Latin. He did not read Hebrew. When he read the Gospel of Matthew in the Vulgate, he read infernum, where the Greek had Gehenna. He could not make the distinction. The conceptual collapse that Jerome's translation had performed was, for Augustine, simply the text. He was working with what he had. But what he had was already a transformed document. The consequences were immense. The medieval imagination of hell, built on Augustine's theology and given visual form by artists from Dante to Hieronymus Bosch, became one of the most powerful engines of social control in human history. Think about what the doctrine of eternal hell actually does in a social context. It means that your choices in this life have infinite consequences. A finite life of sin leads to infinite punishment. This creates an extraordinary lever. Whoever controls the definition of what constitutes damnation holds power over every person who believes in the system. The historian Keith Hopkins, in his work on the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire, noted that the early church's ability to threaten people with post-mortem consequences was one of its most powerful competitive advantages in a marketplace of religions. The Christian hell was not just doctrine. It was infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, is very hard to demolish. What is remarkable about the current moment in religious scholarship is that the demolition is quietly underway. The 19th century English theologian Frederick W. Farrar, in his 1877 work Eternal Hope, argued that the Greek word aionios, usually translated as eternal in the New Testament, did not necessarily mean without end. It meant something more like belonging to the age or of divine quality. If aionios does not mean literally without end, then the famous phrase from Matthew 25, eternal punishment, might mean something closer to punishment appropriate to God's judgment rather than torture without cessation for billions of years. A small philological point with enormous theological consequences. The debate has never been resolved. In the last 30 years, a significant number of evangelical and progressive Christian theologians have moved toward annihilationism, the idea that the wicked are not tormented forever but are simply destroyed and cease to exist. The fire of hell, in this reading, is not an eternal torture chamber but an incinerator. The end is not suffering without end. The end is ending. This view was championed by John Stott, arguably the most influential evangelical theologian of the 20th century, who in the 1980s expressed openness to annihilationism and sent shockwaves through conservative evangelical Christianity. If John Stott could entertain the idea, the question was suddenly mainstream in a way it had not been for centuries. And then there is the universalist position, which has never entirely disappeared since Origin. The theologian David Bentley Hart published a book in 2019 called That All Shall Be Saved, in which he argues with meticulous philosophical rigor that the concept of eternal hell is not only exegetically unjustified, but logically incoherent. A God of infinite love and infinite power who allows finite creatures to suffer infinite torment is not the God described by the classical theological tradition. It is a monster. And the Bible, read carefully in Greek, does not actually teach eternal conscious torment. It was put there by translation choices that are now being seriously questioned. Here is what we see when we zoom out far enough. Across the ancient Near East, independently developed traditions all converge on the same basic afterlife. A neutral, undifferentiated realm for the dead. Sheol, Hades, Hell, Kur. No fire. No judgment. No separation of the righteous from the wicked. Just death. Then, in specific historical moments of crisis and oppression, those traditions begin to develop judgment afterlives. The Zoroastrians crossing the Chinvat Bridge, the Jewish apocalypticists with their valleys of fire, the Buddhist Yama questioning the dead. These developments happen in different times and places, but they share a common logic. Justice deferred is not justice abandoned. And then, in the specifically Western Christian tradition, something happens that does not happen anywhere else at the same scale. The deferred punishment stops being temporary, stops being purifying. It becomes eternal, irrevocable, and total. The fire that was originally a metaphor for shame and disposal, the garbage dump outside Jerusalem, becomes the centerpiece of a theological system that defines the imagination of billions of people for 2,000 years. That transformation was not inevitable. It was made by specific people making specific choices, translating specific words, serving specific institutional interests. Jerome chose one Latin word where there were 4 Greek and Hebrew concepts. Augustine chose to defend eternal punishment even when it troubled him. The church councils chose to condemn Origen. Medieval artists chose to make hell vivid and almost more interesting than heaven. And those choices cascaded forward through centuries until they became so embedded in the Western imagination that people forgot they were choices at all. They forgot that before all of this, there was just the Sheol, the quiet place, the dark place, the place where everyone goes and no one needs to be afraid of it because it simply is and always was. Um, the place that was taken and replaced with something else entirely. And if you read the oldest texts in the oldest languages with the eyes of someone who has not already been told what they mean, you will find it silent, patient. The original answer to the oldest question human beings have ever asked, what happens when we die? For the earliest writers of what became the Bible, the answer was simple. You go to the shadows. You go to the dark. You are remembered by the living and eventually forgotten, and you are simply gone. No fire, no judgment, no torture, no demons, just silence. Someone decided that was not enough. Someone decided people needed more than silence to keep them in line. And so they built the fire word by word, translation by translation, council by council, century by century. And they built it so well that now most people cannot imagine a world without it. But there was a world without it, and the evidence is still there, buried in the oldest layers of the texts, waiting for anyone willing to look. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one I want you to take into the comments and argue about, because this conversation deserves to be louder than it is. If you had been told from childhood that God was not a judge who could send you to eternal fire, but simply the source of being itself, moving through a universe where death was just silence and the dead were just gone, would that have changed who you are? Would it have changed what you feared? Would it have changed how you treated other people? Or did you need the fire to become who you became? Because that question, more than any archaeological discovery or philological argument, cuts to the heart of why this matters. The doctrine of hell was not just a translation error, it was a decision about what kind of people we wanted to produce. And for 2,000 years, it worked. The question now is whether we are still the kind of people who need it. In the next video, we are going to look at something that terrified the early church even more than hell itself. A figure who appears in the book of Job as a member of God's divine council. A prosecutor, not a rebel. A servant, not an enemy. A being who, by the time of the New Testament, had been transformed into the cosmic adversary of God himself. Who was Satan before Satan became Satan? The answer is stranger than you can imagine.